Tonight's presentation is titled Minimally Invasive. Our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation. He's an author for numerous aviation publications, holds a certified flight instructor certificate, A&P mechanic certificate with IA privileges, 2008 FAA's Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year, and a member of EAA. Mike, thanks so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Well, great, Tim. Good evening, everybody. Let's see if I can put my screen up for you. Excuse me. Got a frog here. Well, tonight's presentation is actually a little bit unusual. It's a presentation that I actually gave a slightly different version, but in last month, when I was in Huntsville, Alabama, at the annual convention of the Flying Physicians Association, they have a big convention once a year, and then they have regional conventions throughout the year, meetings throughout the year. And this one was in Huntsville, which is a space city, and we had a very interesting time. I spent 4 days there. I gave a presentation to the docs. I sat through 4 days of continuing medical education, which I find fascinating, even though I'm not a doctor. And then on the final day, we had a VIP tour of the Marshall Space Flight Center and then the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville. Very fascinating trip. And so I'll give a little plug. If I don't know how many of the 500 and some odd of you are physicians, but if any of you are flying physicians, you really ought to think about joining this organization, Flying Physician Association. It's a wonderful group. I'm an honorary member, even though I'm not a physician, and I try to get to their annual meeting every year and give a presentation to the doctors. It's a wonderful group of people, and they do some really, really great things. So, at any rate, a little plug for them if you happen to be a physician who flies. Really good group to join. But you know, for a long time, and I've talked about this before, I've always been struck by the parallels between medicine and aviation maintenance. I often say that A&P mechanics are the surgeons of general aviation, and you know, like medical surgeons, they're in the business of taking things apart, repairing them, and putting them back together. And the parallels are very striking. So, but medicine has is far ahead of aviation maintenance in the area of doing things in a minimally invasive fashion, which has always been one of my hot buttons. And I started my presentation to the doc telling him that I had recently had a lesson in plumbing, and it happened to be my plumbing. I had a couple of nasty bouts of diarrhea, and I went to this TMI stuff I know, but I went to my primary care doc and said, "Hey, doc, this is sort of unusual for me. I wonder if we should follow up on it and see if we can figure out what's going on." And she's a very good internist. She had me do some blood labs. One of the liver enzymes, ALT enzyme, was about twice what it should be. Not enough to really worry about particularly, but in an abundance of caution and with my encouragement, because I'm a data-driven person, she gave me a prescription to go in for an abdominal ultrasound. And when they did the abdominal ultrasound, the good news was that the liver was unremarkable and the pancreas was unremarkable and all that stuff. But they did notice that my common bile duct was dilated. It was larger than it should be, which frequently means that there's something stuck in there. And they saw something in the ultrasound that they thought might be a gallstone that had migrated into the common bile duct and gotten stuck. So they recommended that I have an MRI, and it was about a month and a half before I could get on the schedule for an MRI. But when I went in for the MRI, they saw very clearly that there were two large gallstones that had lodged in my common bile duct and were kind of blocking the path for the liver to put bile into my digestive system. I found this out on a Monday when I had a office visit with the gastroenterologist, and they said there's a procedure for doing this that we would like to do, and we'd like to schedule you for the day after tomorrow. And I said, oh my God. I said, is it that serious? And they said, no, it's not really that serious. It's just that there's only one guy in the county who is qualified to do this procedure. And he's just turned in his letter of resignation. He's going to be gone at the end of the month. He's going down to Santa Barbara. So unless you want to go down to Santa Barbara for this procedure, we need to get you on the schedule right away before he leaves. So I agreed to that. I spent the next day Googling the procedure and learning all I could about it. And the procedure is a procedure called an endoscopic retrograde pancreatography. I'll say that, which is kind of a mouthful, so they always call it an ERCP. And it's basically a procedure where they stick a very specialized borescope in your mouth and down your esophagus and down through the stomach and work it through the pyloric valve at the bottom of the stomach and the top of the intestinal tract. And it's a side-facing borescope, so it's got a 90-degree viewing angle, and they work it down until they find this little sphincter where the common bile duct, which is a duct that connects both the liver and the pancreas and the gallbladder all into the digestive system. So they find this thing, and this is not just a plain ordinary old endoscope or borescope. It has a channel in there where you can insert all sorts of tools. So it's not just something that's used for viewing. It's something that can be used to do, sort of surgical procedures, including removing these stones that were lodged in my common bile duct. So this endoscope has more tools than a Swiss Army knife. There's guide wires, there's probes, there's baskets and snares and inflatable balloons and all sorts of stuff that you can run down the channel of this scope and use to do things that would normally require surgical intervention. I learned, by the way, that the difference between an endoscope and a laparoscope, because I would have guessed that this would have been a laparoscopic procedure. A laparoscope is something that is inserted through a hole that the surgeon makes in you, and an endoscope is something that is inserted through a hole that God put there. It's called a natural orifice. So this was an endoscope that went into a natural orifice and had all these neat tools, and the surgeon was able to remove both of those stones from the bile duct, and it was a somewhat complicated procedure, but it only took about 15 minutes. And I thought it was incredibly cool that they could do it that way, and that they were able to do this in such a minimally invasive fashion without cutting any holes in me. Basically, I was there for a couple hours, went home, had a very slight sore throat because the stuff had been run down my throat, but the sore throat cleared up within a couple hours, and it was a very cool procedure. But even cooler is another thing that I haven't had done to me, but I learned about. My business partner's wife, about 15 years ago, had I guess it was maybe 10 or 11 years ago, was starting to exhibit tiredness and shortness of breath, and her color wasn't very good. And she eventually was diagnosed with a stenotic aortic valve, which is one of the 4 check valves in the heart that passes blood out of the heart into the aorta, where it goes to all of the different parts of the body. It's the kind of the main outlet duct of the heart, and it's a check valve so that when the heart relaxes, the blood that it pumped out doesn't flow back in. And after a while, these valves can get stiff and call it stenosis, and the valve doesn't close properly. So the check valve isn't working quite right, and you get what's called regurgitation through it, and it seriously impairs the ability of the heart to pump blood through your system and causes all sorts of problems. So this was something that had to be dealt with, and when she went in to the hospital, I think it was up at Stanford, to get a valve replacement, an aortic valve replacement. And this was a really big deal. This was an open heart procedure where they had to hook her up to a heart-lung machine, crack her chest, hook her up to a heart-lung machine, stop her heart, and go in there and do this big surgical intervention. Things don't get much more invasive than this procedure. This is worse than pulling a cylinder. It's pretty much like splitting the case. And they put a porcine valve, a valve harvested from a pig's heart in there, and sutured it in and put her all back together. She had a fairly long and painful recovery period, a couple months of recovery, but after she recovered from it, she was pretty much good as new and had very good heart function. So it was very successful, but it was also extremely invasive. Well, it turns out that nowadays they don't do it this way anymore, or very seldom do they do it this way. Stenotic aortic valves are now replaced in a very non-invasive fashion, something called TAVR, transcatheter aortic valve replacement. And this is a procedure that is so unbelievable to me. It's just absolutely remarkable. But somebody invented an artificial aortic valve that can be folded up in such a tiny package that it can be inserted through an artery. Typically, they go in through the femoral artery. They make a little hole down near in the groin area, and they run this thing up. And the procedure involves, first of all, running a balloon through the catheter and expanding the old bad valve so it's wide open, and then running this artificial valve that's all folded up, tiny, up through the artery, putting it in place, inflating a balloon to expand it into place, this artificial valve is sewn to a stent, which is expanded and grabs the side of the vessel and holds on. It's a little hard to do this when the heart is fully pumping, so they use some electrical stimulation to cause the heart to go into tachycardia, which makes it not pump very efficiently while they're doing this, but they don't stop the heart. And this is done just through a tiny incision in the groin, and it's extremely non-invasive, and it's absolutely remarkable that they can do it that way. In fact, it's hard for me to imagine who it was that had such an outside the box thought that they thought, hey, maybe we could do it this way, because it just seems so outlandish that they're able to do it. But it was an experimental procedure for many years. Now it's pretty much the standard of care for aortic valve insufficiency, unless there's some other structural problem with the heart that needs to be repaired, some comorbidity. This is the way it's typically done now, and it's quick and it's easy and it's very, the recovery is essentially zero. You're out of the hospital the next day, and it's just amazing. So, this got me thinking, well, gee, if they can do this, what could we do when we're working on airplanes? And I had this sort of thought while I was in the shower one day about, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could replace exhaust valves this way? We come up with a procedure called retrograde transguide exhaust valve replacement, where an exhaust valve could fold up and be inserted from the outside of the cylinder and then expanded inside, and we wouldn't have to take the cylinder off to replace an exhaust valve. Well, nobody's working on that as far as I know, but it was just an interesting thought. We're so far behind medicine in this area of being minimally invasive, but I think it's really important for mechanics to have a minimally invasive mindset and to try to use the least invasive possible methods to solve problems. And that's not typically the way mechanics are trained. If you take your airplane to a A&P mechanic, the chances are it won't be 5 minutes before he's attacking the aircraft with tools and taking stuff apart, because that's what mechanics do. There's the old expression, I think the Maslow's expression says, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And what kind of tools do mechanics typically have? They have compression testers, and they have cylinder base wrenches and stuff, and they're just kind of trained to be in the business of taking stuff apart. How does your A&P assess cylinder health at the annual inspection? Well, 99% of the time he uses something like this, the differential compression tester. In fact, the way most mechanics were taught, and this is slowly changing, but the way most mechanics were taught, there was a kind of a simple rule. When you did an annual, you used the compression tester on all the cylinders, and any cylinder that was less than 60 over 80 needed to be removed for repair or replacement. And if it was 60 over 80 or better, you could declare it airworthy and leave it there. And so there tends to be a lot of cylinder removal. And it turns out, and most mechanics aren't really aware of this because they aren't trained on it, but cylinder removal is very risky business. And I've actually done a couple of webinars that are in the archive about why I don't like removing cylinders and all of the risks involved. But I think I've had more exposure to this problem than most people, because I do air crash litigation expert witness work frequently as a defense expert, and I've been involved in just a lot of cases. These are 4 of them, where mechanic did cylinder removal on an aircraft, and then shortly thereafter the aircraft had a catastrophic engine failure and crashed. Sometimes, like the one on the bottom right, which happened in Santa Monica some years ago, the 2 people died. The one on the upper right happened up near Salinas, California. It involved very serious injury to both occupants. One of the occupants had permanently impairing traumatic brain injury from this crash. Sometimes the outcomes aren't that bad. The one on the lower right, everybody walked away with only a few scratches, and the one on the upper left, which was the one that happened most recently, only happened last year, where airplane had a catastrophic engine failure, and shortly after takeoff in Florida, the flight right after some cylinder work was done, and wound up going into the ocean. Pilot did an excellent job at ditching. This was a Part 135 flight. Passengers in the back got out basically uninjured. The pilot had some minor injuries and spent a couple of days in the hospital, but Sure could have been a lot worse. But at any rate, I've been on a campaign for a long time to say, hey, we don't always need to remove cylinders to solve problems. But that's kind of the standard of care that mechanics have traditionally been taught. And if you look at where this 60/80 rule is written, I think if you ask most mechanics, they would say, well, it's in the regulations. Well, turns out it's not in the regulations. There's nothing in the regs that talks about 60/80. The regs require, and this is Part 43, Appendix D to be precise, but they do require that you do a compression test at each annual inspection or each 100-hour inspection if the airplane has to have 100-hour inspections. But you are required to do a compression test. That is in the regulations. And then the regulation goes on to say, if compression is weak, the cylinder must be inspected internally. But it doesn't define what weak means, and it doesn't define what inspected internally means. So, some years ago, I asked the FAA lawyers to send a letter requesting an interpretation of whether you could satisfy the requirement to inspect internally a cylinder with weak compression by doing a borescope inspection rather than pulling the cylinder off. And the letter I got back said that yes, the borescope inspection would meet the regulatory requirement to inspect cylinders for improper internal condition and tolerances. So that says you don't have to remove the cylinder to satisfy the internal inspection requirement. And that kind of leaves the question, well, what does weak compression mean? Because the reg doesn't say, it just uses the word weak compression. It doesn't define it anywhere. So if you look for guidance on what weak compression means, you can find it in various places, and they say various different things. It turns out that the 60/80, the old traditional 60/80 rule, the only place that I could find that it's written down that says under 60/80 the cylinder has to come off is in Advisory Circular AC 4313-1B, that kind of the Mechanics Bible, acceptable methods, techniques, and practices, the big giant advisory circular that's the size of a small telephone directory. And what that advisory circular says is this. It says a loss in excess of 25% of the input air pressure, so that would be 60/80, is cause to suspect the cylinder of being defective. However, recheck the readings after operating the engine for at least 3 minutes. And then they say if it's still less than 60/80 on the recheck, then the cylinder needs to come off. That's what it says in the advisory circular. Now, of course, the advisory circular is only an advisory circular. It's not regulatory. But one of the things about AC 4313 is on the very first page of it, it says, basically, don't use the guidance in this advisory circular if the manufacturer gives you guidance that's contrary. In other words, manufacturer's guidance always takes precedence. And the AC 4313-1B is only to be used when there is no manufacturer's guidance. So it turns out that both Lycoming and Continental do have guidance about compression tests. Lycoming's guidance is in their service instruction 1191A, and what it says there is, if the pressure reading, meaning on the compression tester, is below 60 psi, removal and overhaul of the cylinders should be considered. It doesn't say required, it says should be considered. So that actually gives the IA an awful lot of wiggle room. Most IAs don't have the courage to take the wiggle room. But Lycoming is not saying that the cylinder must be removed. It just is saying that removal of the cylinder should be considered if the reading is below 60. Continental's guidance is quite a bit more involved than that. The Continental's guidance originally appeared in 2003 in a service bulletin called SB 03-3. The contents of that service bulletin has now moved into the Continental Standard Procedures Manual M0. And basically what that guidance does is it has a bunch of stuff in it. First of all, it says, it sets the no-go compression threshold to not 60 over 80, but they actually don't give you a specific number. They say you need to test your compression tester with a master orifice tool. And then whatever it reads when it's measuring leakage through the master orifice is the no-go threshold. And for most compression testers, when you do that, the threshold turns out to be somewhere between 40 over 80 and 45 over 80. I'm actually just started the annual on my airplane and did the compression tests last week, and master orifice reading that day on my gauge was 44. So 44 over 80 was the threshold, and my airplane has Continental engines. So they set the threshold way lower than 60, and then this guidance goes on to say that anytime you do a compression test, and of course the FAA requires that you do a compression test at every annual and every 100-hour inspection, but Continental says anytime you do a compression test, you also have to do a bore scope inspection. And they use the word required about 9 times in this guidance. So they're really quite serious about doing a bore scope inspection. And then they say, if the cylinder flunks the compression test, meaning it's under that 40-ish number that's the master orifice threshold, but it still looks okay under the bore scope, then the engine should be flown for at least 45 minutes, and then the compression test should be repeated. Now, let me ask you, how many shops do you suppose, if they get a low compression reading on a Continental engine, actually go ahead and put all the spark plugs back and button up the engine and then tell the owner, go fly the airplane for at least 45 minutes and bring it back? That almost never happens. But it's actually very good guidance. We once had a client with a Cirrus SR22 that was an annual down in Florida someplace, that the shop did a compression test and this cylinder came up at 38 over 80, which was below the master orifice threshold, and the shop wanted to pull the cylinder, and we said no. We said we want you to follow the service bulletin at that time. So they did a bore scope inspection, and there didn't seem to be anything wrong with the cylinder. The bore scope, it looked just fine on the bore scope. So we convinced the shop to put the airplane back together and let the owner go fly it. And the owner flew it for an hour, brought it back. They rechecked the cylinder, and this time, instead of being 38 over 80, the cylinder was 72 over 80. So it's actually pretty good guidance, but very, very seldom would a shop actually follow this guidance. It's just because it's so inconvenient for them to put the airplane all back together just to do this. Interestingly enough, although Continental requires, or says a bore scope inspection is always required whenever you do a compression test, it doesn't give any guidance on how to do a bore scope inspection. In fact, there's no place that we were able to find any guidance on how to do a bore scope inspection of a cylinder. Not in any maintenance manuals, not in any service bulletins, not in any FAA advisory circulars, absolutely nothing. And you'd kind of think if Continental was going to require a bore scope inspection, they'd tell you how to do it, because they go into a great chapter and verse about how to do a compression test, but they don't say anything about how to do bore scope inspection. What images to capture, what anomalies to look for, and any of that stuff. So anyway, it turns out that the compression test is a terrible way to assess cylinder airworthiness. There's 2 big problems with the compression test. The first is it's unreliable. If you test the same cylinder multiple times, and you can get wildly different results. The guy in Florida, it was 38 over 80. He flew it for an hour. Now it's 72 over 80. And nobody really believes that the cylinder got really, really sick and then magically healed itself in that hour. It's just that the compression test is so unreliable. And the other problem is that, even if it was reliable, the compression test is not a valid test of cylinder health. It doesn't measure what it purports to measure, which is whether the cylinder is healthy or not. Perfectly healthy cylinders can exhibit very poor compression, and sick cylinders can exhibit really good compression. And I don't have a slide for this because it's so new, but I actually ran into this just in the last couple of days with my own annual inspection. I had just flown the airplane on 2 fairly long trips, 20-hour trips, one from California to Houston and back, where I went to visit the Shell Technology Center, and then another one to Huntsville and back, where I went to the Flying Physicians meeting. And I'd put a lot of time on the airplane, and it was running like a top. It's just perfect, and the engine monitor data looked perfect and everything. So when I did the compression test last week, I kind of expected all the cylinders were going to be fine. And all of a sudden, I ran into, I guess it was cylinder number 6 or something on the right engine that was measuring 20 over 80. 20 over 80. Oh my God, how can that be? This engine's running perfectly. So I won't get into all of it, but basically I converted the 20 over 80 compression test with a little work into a 70 over 80 compression test without pulling the cylinder off. But 99% of the time, if you put an airplane in the shop, it had a cylinder that was 20 over 80, that cylinder would come off in the next 15 minutes. And we need to kind of stop thinking that way, because it isn't always necessary. But at any rate, even though Continental doesn't say how to do a bore scope inspection, or a good bore scope inspection is vastly more reliable way to assess cylinder health. Unfortunately, very few A&Ps know how to perform one, because there isn't any guidance from the manufacturer, and they don't teach this in A&P school and stuff, and it's really a shame. It's got to change. So as I mentioned, I actually did a webinar on this. Savvy launched a borescope initiative the first of this year, and among other things, we came up with a specific imaging protocol saying exactly what views we want taken with a borescope for cylinder inspection, and we identified 11 specific views or shots, if you will, to take when the borescope is inside the cylinder. And we did a 35-minute video that's on YouTube demonstrating exactly how to do this. Dave Pasquale actually did the 11 views on a cylinder and kind of talked his way through it, and it's all captured on video to teach people how to do it this way. And the cool thing about the borescope is it not only tells you whether a cylinder is healthy or sick, and it's very reliable, much more reliable than the compression tester. But if it's sick, it tells you exactly what's wrong, and it tells you how serious it is. And how serious it is really important, because if it's not too serious, then there's a really good chance that the problem can be resolved without removing the cylinder. And in our experience, at least 50% of the time, when a cylinder is exhibiting weak compression, that problem can be resolved without pulling the cylinder off. And we think we need to start training mechanics that they have to stop having this knee-jerk reaction that weak compression means the cylinder has to come off. That we don't want to do open heart surgery if we can use an endoscope or something like that. It's just if we catch problems early, and the best way to catch problems early is to do regular borescope inspections. If we catch problems early enough, we can usually solve them without pulling the cylinder off. If we wait until a problem gets really, really bad, then there may be no alternative but to pull a cylinder off. But if we catch the problems early, we can usually resolve the problem through minimally invasive procedures like lapping the valves in place if it's a problem with a leaky valve, or performing a solvent ring flush if it's a problem with leakage past the rings. You know, and if the cylinder is seriously ill, maybe it has a broken ring or detonation damage or something, you can see that very clearly in the bore scope inspection as well. And obviously, if you see something like that, then the cylinder is going to have to come off. But we should always try to avoid cylinder removal unless there's no alternative. And the bore scope gives us the information we need to make that decision in an educated way. So the two procedures that the minimally invasive procedures that we have been trying to get mechanics to use in cases of cylinder problems that are not terribly severe are lapping the valves in place and the solvent ring flush. And lapping the valve in place is the most common thing that we do because leakage past the exhaust valve is the most common reason for weak compression. With the bore scope, we can get a really good idea of why the valve's leaking, what its condition is, and whether it's something that is going to require the valve to actually be replaced, which it can happen if the problem is very advanced. But if we catch it early enough, we can solve it simply by lapping the valve in place. The bore scope will give us a really good idea whether the valve's a good candidate for this or not. Valves like this are really far gone. The one on the left is hours from destruction. If you look at it carefully, you'll notice that just to the right of the 12 o'clock position, it's actually started to develop a hoop stress crack in the valve. So that valve is about to get ingested if the engine runs very long. The valve on the right isn't quite as far gone as the valve on the left, but it's pretty far gone, and it's probably not a great candidate for lapping. But valves like this, the one on the left, is pretty much what my 20/80 cylinder looked like. It had clearly an asymmetric pattern to it, but it was an early stage of burning. The one on the right is kind of a marginal candidate. Lapping might fix it or might not. But in cases like that, it's always worth trying to lap the valve. And if you're not successful, you always have the option of pulling the cylinder later. But it always, to me, makes sense in a borderline case to try the minimally invasive procedure first before resorting to something more invasive. And we look at the head of the valve like this. We get a sort of a heat signature that gives us a pretty good idea what's going on. But even more revealing, and something that not too many mechanics have been trained to do, is to get views like this of the valve, where we open the valve and we work the bore scope in so that we're getting a nice side view of the valve and of the seat. And because at the end of the day, what's really important are the contact surfaces between the valve and the seat. That's what's going to determine whether the valve is sealing properly or not. And what we would like to see is contact surfaces like that photo in the lower right, where there's a nice shiny contact surface indicating really good contact with the seat, and that contact signature is fairly even in width all the way around the circumference of the valve. The one on the upper left, the contact surface has gotten kind of rough due to a phenomenon called microwelding, which happens and causes a little metal transfer between the seat and the valve, and there's some deposits and stuff, and the little lapping can clean that right up and have a huge impact on what the compression rating is going to be. And there's just no reason in the world to be pulling a cylinder off just to solve a problem like that. Anytime we lap a valve, part of the procedure is we have to pull the valve springs off to free up the valve so that we can rotate it. And so if it's an exhaust valve, we're taking off the rotocoil or the rotator cap. The Continental calls it a rotocoil. Lycoming calls it a rotator cap. They look different, but both of them, their function is to cause the valve to rotate slightly every time it opens and closes. And these things have a tendency to go bad after a while. We've particularly had problems with the Continental rotocoils stopping rotation, which is one reason why valves will start to burn. So since we have to take it apart, take it off, we always put a new rotator cap or rotocoil on. I just did that on my engine last week. I lapped a valve, I put a new rotocoil on. I think the rotocoil was $24. It's a cheap part, and so it's just worth replacing on general principles. Here's some before and after pictures I got from a friend of mine, Dr. Gary Silver, happens to be a flying physician, but he's also an ANPIA. He has a Cessna 421 with a pair of big Gitzo 520 engines, and he was doing a borescope inspection and found a pretty profound smile on one of his exhaust valves, indicating that the valve was burning. He decided that this was a good candidate for lapping. I agree. He lapped the valve in place. He replaced the rotocoil and went and flew the airplane. Normally, I fly it for 15 hours before I go back and take another look, but he was impatient. So he flew the airplane for 1.7 hours, and his curiosity got the better of him. He pulled the spark plug, stuck a borescope in, and the valve looked perfect, and all the signs of the abnormal heat signature had completely disappeared after just 1.7 hours of flight after he lapped the valve and changed the rotocoil. You know, lapping valves is standard operating procedure when cylinders are sent in for repair, but in that case, the lapping is usually done this way. There's a tool with a suction cup at the end of it that you stick to the head of the valve, and then you put some valve grinding compound on the contact surfaces, and you spin the valve. But of course, if the cylinder is on the airplane, we can't do it this way because this tool would have to be inside the cylinder, and maybe one of these days we'll get a tricky borescope that lets us do this. That's not actually beyond the realm of possibility to do that. But at the moment, we can't do that. So what we have to do is we have to spin the valve from the outside by taking the valve springs off, taking the rocker off, and then the valve springs off. And then we connect the stem of the valve to an electric drill with a flexible coupling. I use a piece of a 1/2-inch ID automotive brake hose is what I usually use to hook the drill to the valve. And then we figure out some way to put some valve grinding compound in there, and we spin the valve from the outside of the cylinder and lap the valve that way. The traditional way of doing this, which has been done by mechanics for many years, not enough mechanics, but is to drop the exhaust and then have access to the contact surface of the valve through the exhaust port, and insert the valve grinding compound that way through the exhaust port, and then spin the valve. You lap it for a while, then you stick a borescope in and inspect what the contact surfaces look like. If you still don't like what you see, you go lap it some more, and you just keep iterating it until you're happy with with what the contact surfaces look like, and it should be like nice and shiny and of constant width and stuff. And now, some years ago, I ran into a problem with my airplane where I was doing an annual inspection, and I wound up with a cylinder that was measuring 30, about 36, a little less than 36 over 80, with air leaking past the exhaust valve. When I put the borescope in, I saw this non-symmetrical heat signature, but it didn't seem like it was very far gone, and it seemed like it would be a good candidate for lapping. So I decided that I would try lapping the valve. I'd never actually done it myself before. The problem is that my engines are turbocharged, and dropping the exhaust is a real pain in the butt. And so I wondered whether there was some way that I could do this thing without having to drop the exhaust. And I thought about it for a while, and came up with a scheme that I thought might work. And it involved buying a pack of 100 gun cleaning swabs off of Amazon. These are cleaning long, like Q-tips on steroids, but the tip is not cotton. It's kind of a spongy foam, and the shaft is not wood. It's plastic. And so I got these gun cleaning swabs, and I used a heat gun to heat up the shaft and put a 45-degree bend in the shaft. And after a little experimentation, I got the bend right where I could stick this thing through the lower spark plug hole and work it around to get it between the exhaust valve and the exhaust valve seat. So I could load up the end of this swab with a whole bunch of grinding compound, work it in through the bottom spark plug hole, the top spark plug hole. I've got a bore scope so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm working through the bottom spark plug hole, and I work the swab to where it's between the valve and the seat. I close the valve against the swab. I spin the valve around to distribute the compound. I do this a couple times, and then I take the swab out and I hook the electric drill up to the valve, and I spin it and lather, rinse, repeat until I get the results that I want. So this is a super non-invasive way. This is using natural orifices only. Don't have to open anything up. Don't have to take anything apart. All we're doing is taking top and bottom spark plugs out, and that's all the access we need, which is obviously taking the valve springs off as well. But we don't have to drop the exhaust or the intake or take any baffling off or anything like that. It's just a very quick and easy procedure, and I've now done it a bunch of times, but this was the first time I did it. And I was so enthused that you could do it this way without having to drop the exhaust off the engine that I made a video, which is also up on YouTube, showing exactly how I did it. But at any rate, my first attempt at lapping, that cylinder went from a little less than 36 over 80 hot to 71 and a half over 80 cold. That was about a little over 100 hours ago that I did that. And I just measured that cylinder last week, and it was measuring 76 over 80 hot. So the lapping was successful, and it lasted. So that was good. But I just lapped a valve last week on a cylinder that measured 20 over 80, and it came up to 70 over 80. And the 70 over 80 was a cold reading, so it's probably better than that hot. The other procedure that we like to use in the case that air, we do a compression check and air is escaping past the rings, or where the owner is complaining of that oil consumption has gone up and there's a bunch of oil on the belly out, after the breather, is a solvent ring flush procedure. Because it turns out that an awful lot of the time where we have leakage past the rings there's nothing really wrong with the rings. It's just that they're gunked up. They're stuck in their grooves because there's a bunch of sludge build up in there, which makes it impossible for the rings to move normally, and that interferes with their ability to seal the combustion chamber. This sludge is kind of nasty stuff. It's heavily laced with lead, and I think when the day comes that we are running on unleaded avgas, that this problem will be much less than it is now. But in any case, this lead sludge gets into the ring grooves, it gets into the slotted oil control ring, and it gets into these little feed holes that are drilled in the oil control ring groove to allow oil to pass from the inside of the piston to the oil control ring groove. The top two grooves are compression rings. The third one down is the oil control ring. And then some pistons have a fourth ring that's way down below the piston pin called a scraper ring, and some don't, only have 3 rings. But in any case, this is where we get sludge buildup. And if the condition is caught early enough, it can be remediated without cylinder removal. A procedure is really a very simple procedure. In fact, it's so simple that I think arguably an owner could do it as preventive maintenance under the Khalil interpretation, because you usually do it in conjunction with an oil change, and basically consists of treating each cylinder by filling the combustion chamber with a solvent mixture, putting the spark plugs in, and then pulling on the prop to force the solvent mixture past the ring pack into the crankcase, where it'll drain out into a bucket. And the first time you do this, it usually is quite hard to pull the prop through and force the fluid through. And then you repeat it, and it gets easier and easier. And finally, when it feels nice and free, you declare victory and you go on to the next cylinder. And then when you're all done, you service the engine with fresh oil and stuff. But it's a very easy procedure. Actually, the idea for it came from Ed Collin, who's the lubrication engineer, used to run the Exxon engine lab, and the inventor of CamGuard, and probably the smartest aviation oil guy that I've ever met. Just a wealth of knowledge. But he came up with this idea, and I asked him if it was okay for me to write it up in detail so that mechanics had some guidance to follow. And he said, fine, just don't put my name on it. So I didn't. But at any rate, Ed gets the credit for coming up with this idea, and I've sort of perfected the procedure a little bit. And the procedure is available online. And it's just a 3-page write-up that tells you step by step how to do it, how to mix up the solvent mixture, and how to do the procedure. It's very simple. Like I say, it's something that probably an aircraft owner could do on his own recognizance as preventive maintenance. It's so simple, because all it really requires is taking out the top spark plug and the oil drain plug. So it's about as minimally invasive as you can get, and it works remarkably well. Here's one success story I found on a Mooney forum. The guy said one cylinder had very low compression. You could hear air was leaking past the rings. So we tried doing the solvent flush. The cylinder has made 75/80 after that. So, and this is fairly common. Now, and I'll have to be honest, this doesn't always work. If the rings are so badly sludged up, it may be that you just can't, no matter how hard you pull on the prop, you can't force the fluid past the rings. They're just too badly sludged up. And it's not uncommon to do this on an engine and have, if say a 6-cylinder engine, have 5 of the cylinders get cleaned up with the procedure, and the 6th cylinder just be so stubborn that you can't do it. In which case, what was meant to be a therapeutic procedure becomes a diagnostic procedure. At least for sure that your rings are terminally sludged up, and probably the only thing you can do to solve that is to pull the cylinder and clean up the piston mechanically. But it works a lot more often than it fails. And actually, there's probably a pretty reasonable case to be made, maybe for doing this prophylactically, say every 500 hours or so, to keep the ring pack clean and not let it get to the point where you can't clean it out. But we definitely have seen some cases where the sludge was so bad that you you couldn't get rid of it with a solvent flush, but most of the time the solvent flush is very effective, and it's very easy. And it's, you know, anytime there's a problem with air escaping past the rings, it just would make no sense not to at least try this. You know, and as I said before, you always have the option of pulling the cylinder, but it really doesn't make sense to pull a cylinder without at least trying less invasive techniques first. So the big takeaway here is weak compression doesn't always mean that the cylinder has to come off. What it does mean that the cylinder needs to be bore scoped to determine what's going on. And if there's an exhaust leak and it's not at the terminal stage where the valve is physically no good, then there's a very good chance that the problem can be remediated by doing the lapping in place procedure. And if you follow the procedure that I came up with, you don't even have to drop the exhaust. It's just a very simple procedure. This is one that does require an A&P because it does require taking the rocker cover and the rocker arm and the valve springs off, but it doesn't require taking anything else apart. And, you know, if there's leakage past the rings, the solvent ring flush is so simple that it's definitely worth a try. And most of the time it works, and every so often it doesn't. And frequently it'll work on most of your cylinders, but maybe you'll have one stubborn one that it won't work on. And then you have to decide whether the compression is so low or the oil consumption is so high that you can't live with it, and it's worth taking the cylinder off. But in any case, it'll improve things a lot, and it's probably not a bad idea to consider doing the solvent ring flush every 500 hours or so, just to keep things from getting to that point. So cylinder removal should be treated as a last resort, you know, kind of like open heart surgery, after less invasive and less risky techniques have been tried. You just can't discount the fact that cylinder removal is risky business, and that there have been, you know, a lot of catastrophic engine failures that happen shortly after cylinder removal. So, you know, sometimes we have to do it, but we don't want to do it anytime we can avoid it. And an awful lot of the time we can avoid it. And Tim, that's really all I have. But looks like we have some time that we could open it up for Q&A.
All right, thanks, Mike. Jumping in, Joe was wondering if you have superior cylinders on a Continental engine, which manufacturer's guidance do you follow?
Well, you know, I'm not sure that Superior has guidance with regard to compression tests, but you know, the general rule, and I'm just going to say this, I'm not saying you should always follow the general rule, but the general rule is that the manufacturer of the largest components guidance takes precedence. So for example, if Continental says X, but Cessna says Y, you're supposed to do what Cessna says. Now, most of the time, Cessna will defer to Continental with regard to engine stuff, and it won't say anything. But if there's a conflict between the airframe manufacturer and the engine manufacturer, the airframe manufacturers takes precedence. So using that same principle, I think that if there's a conflict between a cylinder manufacturer and the engine manufacturer on which the cylinder was mounted, the engine manufacturer's guidance would take precedence. But that's only a theory.
Many people are wondering about the valve lapping compound. So Lauren's question kind of summarizes that. What happens to the abrasive lapping compound?
Everybody always
do anything to get rid of it? Does it hurt anything?
Everybody always asks that. I try to clean it up as best I can, and as I've got more experience doing this, I've come up with better cleaning approaches. typically I start out by, after I'm satisfied with the results of the lapping, I'll take a couple of those gun cleaning swabs that I bent at 45 degrees, and I'll saturate the tip with a strong solvent rather than saturating it with lapping compound. And I'll insert it between the seat and the valve, and I'll spin the valve and clean as much off as I can that way. Then once I've cleaned it off that way, I have a little piece of plastic tubing that I've sealed off the end and made a tiny hole in the side of, that I can stick up through the spark plug hole. I can fill this tube with solvent, and then I can use shop air to blow the solvent through this side facing hole right into the valve and wash it. The cleaning is not perfect, but it really doesn't matter, because if you have lapping compound, say on the back of the valve or the valve stem or whatever, the minute you start the engine, I mean, lapping compound is basically a heavy grease into which little silicon carbide particles, abrasive particles are. So the minute the engine starts, the grease instantly liquefies, and the particles are forcibly blasted out the exhaust pipe. They're not going to get anywhere where they can do any damage. So the answer is we kind of cleaned it out the best we can, but we don't obsess over getting it perfectly clean, because there's really not going to be any harm. If there's a little bit left in there, it's going to get blasted out. Now, if you were lapping an intake valve, you might want to be a little bit more careful, because anything on the intake valve is going to get sucked into the cylinder rather than blasted out of the cylinder. But 99% of the time, you're lapping an exhaust valve, because those are the ones that have problems. And it's not, in my opinion, it's not important to get it scrupulously clean of lapping compound. You just clean it up the best you can, and the rest of it will get thrown out the back door the minute the engine starts.
Rob wonders, when a cylinder fails, say 38 over 80, what paperwork does the shop need to complete to fly the airplane? Once the plane goes into annual, it is no longer airworthy, and how can I fly an airplane in that instance?
That's very interesting that you should say that, because when we had that SR-22 in Florida a few years ago that I was talking about, that had the 38 over 80 cylinder, I had exactly that conversation with the director of maintenance. We basically walked him through the Continental guidance, and we had him do the borescope inspection and share the images with us, and we all agreed we couldn't find anything wrong. And then we said, well, the next step in the Continental guidance is to fly the airplane for 45 minutes and then retest the cylinder hot. And he says, well, how am I supposed to do that? You're not telling me that I can sign off an annual inspection as airworthy with a 38 over 80 cylinder. And I said, I'm telling you exactly that. That's exactly what I want you to do. I want you to sign off the annual as airworthy, and then let the pilot go fly the airplane. And he said, on what authority am I allowed to do that? And I said, on the authority of Continental Motors. Look what they say to do. You're just following Continental's instructions. So he very reluctantly signed off the annual against his better judgment, and the pilot went off, flew the plane for an hour. They were standing by with their compressor and their gauges and their spark plug wrench and their number 2 Phillips screwdriver, and they hopped on it immediately when he got back in, and it tested 72 over 80 on the retest. But yeah, he asked me the same question. And it wasn't an easy sell, but I finally convinced him that that's what he ought to do, and we had a good outcome from it. And there wasn't anything wrong with the cylinder. Absolutely nothing wrong. What was wrong was the compression test. The compression test is a terrible test.
Randall wonders, and several people have wondered this, what sort of borescope do you recommend? Any particular make model?
Well, the borescope that a lot of us use is is a Vividia VA 400. There are several flavors of that VA 400, and it's important to get the latest version of it. It's up to version 5, and they keep getting better. And unfortunately, they don't change the part number. I actually my most recent acquisition, I've got about 4 borescopes now in my toolbox, but is something called a VA 400i, and the I stands for iPhone or iPad, and it's a version of it that's designed specifically to work with Apple devices, iPads and iPhones as imaging devices. But there are various versions of the VA 400, and the reason we like it is it's just a really excellent scope, and it's dirt cheap. They're selling them around $250. There are a lot of good low-cost scopes on the market, and the basic guidance we give is the scope has to have good resolution, full HD resolution, and it has to have an articulating tip so that you can point it in whatever direction you want to point it after you stick it inside the spark plug hole, to be able to get things like those side views of the valve when they're open and so on. And we like rigid scopes better than flexible scopes for cylinder work. Flexible scopes are great for looking in the airframe and stuff, but for working inside the cylinder, a rigid scope works better because the flexible scope is just too hard to position inside a cylinder. So we like a rigid scope. Second choice is what's called a semi-rigid scope, which is a flexible scope that isn't very flexible. Typically, if the flexible scope has a probe diameter of 8.5 millimeters or larger, then it's semi-rigid, and if it's like a 6 millimeter scope, it's very flexible, and those things don't work real well on cylinders. But a lot of us use the Vividia VA 400 that's made by a company called Oasis Scientific, and they're quite inexpensive, and they do just a beautiful job, make just stunningly beautiful pictures.
And like you said, it's important to get the latest version because over the years they've really improved the resolution on those.
Yeah, we've had some people order them off of Amazon, and when you order them off of Amazon, you never know what version you're going to get. If you order them directly from Oasis Scientific, their website, then you know you're going to get the latest version.
Kevin wonders, can or how do you identify a broken piston ring using a borescope inspection?
Typically, if there's a broken ring, what we're looking for are vertical scratches on the cylinder wall, and ones that look pretty fresh, that aren't heavily coated with varnish, but look like they're pretty fresh, and that would be the clue that there's a broken ring.
Wesley wonders, as it relates to low cylinder compressions, other than the compression test itself, are there any other typical indications, ideally data from an engine monitor, that can corroborate with a weak cylinder other than borescope?
Well, I mean, if there's actually a problem with the cylinder, it will almost always, and the problem is a problem that involves combustion, which is kind of what the cylinder is all about. It will almost always show up in the engine monitor data. I mean, the thing that we've learned is that the cylinder can have miserable compression when you're doing the test, and can be working absolutely flawlessly when you're actually flying the airplane. And that's because the test is testing the cylinder under very, very abnormal conditions. I mean, we're testing a cylinder with 80 psi air being pumped into it, whereas when the engine is actually running, the peak combustion pressure is more like 800 psi. And if an exhaust valve it's going to seal a whole lot better with 800 psi trying to push it closed, and the rings are going to seat way better. Plus, the other thing is the temperature difference. When we're doing a compression test, even if we try to do a quote hot compression test and pull the airplane into the hangar right after they came in from a flight and pull off the cowl just as quick as we can, pull out the spark plugs as quick as we can, we're still measuring the cylinder at a very cool temperature compared to what the temperature is when the airplane's actually in flight. And at normal operating temperature, the clearance between the piston and the cylinder wall is typically very small, and there's not much of a gap that the rings have to make up at all. There were actually some students up at UND that actually tried running a Lycoming engine with no compression rings installed, and it actually ran. It was able to make, I don't know, 70% power or something with no compression rings installed. But when we're doing the compression test and everything is drastically cooler, I mean, it'd be very unusual to have cylinder head temperature of as high as even 200 degrees when you're doing a compression test, because you just can't get the test stuff hooked up fast enough to do that. Plus, the first cylinder you test is going to be hotter than the last cylinder you test, and if you have a twin, by the time you get to the last cylinder, they're going to be ice cold. But the colder it is, the sloppier the fit between the piston and the cylinder, because the cylinder barrel is made of steel and the piston is made of aluminum, and aluminum has twice the temperature, the expansion coefficient that steel does. So the piston shrinks a whole lot more than the cylinder shrinks as they cool down, and so there's a very sloppy fit. And so the rings have to stick way far out and try to seal up this very sloppy fit, which is something that doesn't happen when the engine's running. When the engine's running, there's a very close tolerance fit between the piston and the cylinder, and the rings don't really have much of an annulus to fill up. So it's just a test that's done under very unusual conditions that have very little correlation with what happens when the engine's really running.
James was wondering, would a ring bath be appropriate if the compression is always excellent, but oil consumption has increased?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the two reasons that we will do the ring wash is if oil consumption has increased. Specifically, if oil consumption has increased and there's oil on the belly of the aircraft. In other words, that the oil consumption is caused by blow-by pressurized crankcase and oil being blown out the breather, as opposed to oil that's actually being burned up in consumption and going out the exhaust pipe.
John wonders, does infrequent flying contribute significantly to piston ring gunk?
That's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that. I really don't know the answer to that. One of the things that contributes a lot is the relationship between the I'm blocking on the word here, but the displacement, I guess, of the engine and the amount of oil that it carries in the sump. We've seen a particularly high incidence of sticking rings in the Cirrus SR-22s and the Columbia 400s and stuff, which have large displacement Continental 550 engines with unusually small oil sumps. The Cirrus and Columbia's oil sumps are only 8 quarts instead of 12, and nobody ever fills them more than about 6, because if you do, the top 2 quarts will blow out the breather in short order. So you're asking a small amount of oil to deal with a large amount of blow-by, and those engines seem to be more prone to sludging problems than engines where the sump size is larger or the displacement is smaller. I mean, like the engines on my airplane, they're IO 550s, and the sump capacity is 12 quarts, and I usually run it around 9 or something. But the Cirrus is 8 quarts, and most people run it about 6, and it's a larger displacement engine. So those engines tend to be particularly vulnerable to sludging problems.
Russ says, this is great stuff, but what is the path to get the FAA to start socializing with A&Ps that this is an approved set of methods?
Well, that's never going to happen. But I mean, you bring up an interesting point, which is that mechanics almost never use approved methods. For example, nothing in the maintenance manual is approved. It's acceptable. Anything in the maintenance manual, the methods, techniques, and practice in the maintenance manual are acceptable to the FAA. They're not approved by the FAA. The FAA doesn't ever have to have even looked at it. The only section of a maintenance manual that the FAA ever approves is an airworthiness limitations section, which would only apply to a Part 23 airplane like a Cirrus or a Diamond or something. But mechanics don't use approved procedures. They use acceptable procedures. And what the regulation says, and the regulation I'm talking about now is 43.13a, which is the 4313 is the basic performance rule for mechanics, and it says that the mechanic shall use methods, techniques, and practices prescribed by the manufacturer in the manufacturer's maintenance manual or instructions for continuing airworthiness, or other methods, techniques, and practices acceptable to the administrator or acceptable to the FAA. And there's a lot of guidance from the FAA, written guidance from the FAA about what acceptable to the FAA means. And when it comes to methods, techniques, and practices, acceptable to the FAA does not mean that the FAA has approved it. It does not mean that the FAA has ever looked at it. It only means that if the FAA ever looked at it, they wouldn't have cause to find it unacceptable. In other words, it wouldn't run afoul of any regulation or any written FAA policy. So, we've been lapping valves in place for years. I've been doing webinars about it. I've been doing talks at AirVenture about it, and nobody from the FAA has ever said, anything suggesting that the FAA would not, is unhappy with this. They say, "Hey, Mike, you're not allowed to say stuff like that." They will do. They haven't. Nobody from the FAA has had any quibbles with this. So, and lapping valves has been done since time immemorial when cylinders are off the engine. So, if it's acceptable when they're off the engine, how would the FAA find it unacceptable if you do it when the cylinder is on the engine? It just, there doesn't seem to be any rational case for suggesting that this procedure would not be acceptable to the FAA. But it's never going to be approved because none of the procedures we use are approved by the FAA. The FAA isn't in the business of approving procedures. Like I say, the only procedures they approve are ones in airworthiness limitation section. Most of us don't even have airworthiness limitation sections in our maintenance manuals unless we, own an airplane that was certified after 1990 or so. But the procedures that mechanics use are acceptable procedures, not approved procedures.
Bryant wonders, what engine operational conditions promote an exhaust valve to burn? age of the valve, improper leaning procedures, or should the roto coils be replaced every 1,000 hours? What is it?
Well, rotocoil failure is one of the things that we've seen that causes it, but a big part of it is that the valve and seat were not properly set up when the cylinder was manufactured. We've seen lots of cylinders come out of the factory that had valve problems right out of the factory, and the valves will start to burn at 500-600 hours. And the pilots always think, oh God, what did I do wrong? And because they always figure, oh, it's got to be something I did, and it's usually not something the pilot did. It's usually, I mean, it is possible for the pilot to abuse things, but most of the time it's because the cylinder, uh, the valves weren't ground correctly, or the concentricity between the valve guide and the valve seat was not perfect, so the valves were going in lopsided. Another thing that can lead to it is that the valve guides wear over time. It's just natural. The rocker imparts a kind of a side to side pressure on the valve as it opens and closes, because they're not roller rockers. They have a toe that applies friction to the top of the valve, and so the valve guide tends to oval out over time, and the fit starts to get a little bit sloppy, and all of those things contribute to valve issues. But frequently it's just that the cylinder didn't have the correct, was not machined exactly correctly in terms of the fit of the valve, the guide, and the seat when it was manufactured, and so the thing winds up having problems earlier than TBO. But again, if we keep an eye on them, and at the first sign, because a healthy valve under a borescope, it just screams that it's healthy. It has this nice symmetrical bullseye pattern on it, and you say, oh yeah, that's perfect. And when you see a valve that doesn't have that nice concentric symmetric pattern on it, something's not right. And usually, if you're looking at it, that's long before you've lost compression, and certainly long before there's any operational symptoms. But if we catch these things early and clean them up, then the valve won't ever get to the point of burning badly enough that the cylinder needs to be replaced.
Well, Mike, thanks. Great presentation. We kind of bumped up against the end of our time here. Looks like we had about 650 logged in. Take a moment and share closing thoughts.
Well, I'm glad that there are 650 people that know that I had a dilated common bile duct. I don't share that with that many people very often, but I'm sure I'm going to get a whole bunch of emails now from you guys that say, hey, you really ought to have a cholecystectomy to get your gallbladder removed and stuff. Please don't send me emails like that. Any rate, but I digress. If you would like to be on our mailing list for our monthly newsletter, the next issue of the newsletter is due out about the 20th of this month. Easiest way to get on the list is to text the word SAVVY, SAVVY, to 33777, and little text bot will pop up and ask you for your name and email address and add you to our mailing list. Or you can go onto the SAVVY website and get yourself on the list that way. My 4 books are available where all of these places where fine books are sold. The first 3 are available in audiobook form. The 4th one, we are really close to being finished with it. The recording just the last few chapters of the 50 chapters of that ownership volume 2. And if it's not available by AirVenture, it will be very shortly after AirVenture that the audiobook version of that will be available. And I know a lot of people have preferred to do the audiobook version rather than the printed version because they can, listen to it in the car during their commute or whatever. So I'm a big audiobook fan myself. So we're real close to completing the last audiobook of the series. Our podcast comes out twice a month now. Ask the ANPs that it's a call-in podcast that I do with Colleen Sterling and Paul New, and we're doing a live recording session at AirVenture this year. In fact, the live recording sessions at the last 2 AirVentures have been so successful and have been standing room only that we're actually doing 2 live recording sessions, podcast sessions at AirVenture on Tuesday morning and Saturday morning. The 3 of us are going to be on stage at the AOPA pavilion near the flight line, dealing with questions from the audience that we will have absolutely no chance to prepare for. So that should be fun. And finally, these are my next 3 webinars. The next one, the July one, is scheduled a little bit weird. Normally they're on the first Wednesday of the month. The first Wednesday of July is July 3rd, and I'm actually going to be on a 787 returning to California from the United Kingdom on that day. So we've rescheduled that webinar for the following Tuesday, July 9th. And there'll be a tale of 2 pre-buys, discussing a couple of pre-buy examinations, one that was spectacularly unsuccessful and the other one that was spectacularly successful, and just contrasting them. And the August one will be talking about the difficulty of keeping our older airplanes flying because the replacement parts are either unaffordable or unobtainable. And finally, in September, I've got a webinar called Can't Sign It Off, where I talk about a real life adventure that we had with one of our clients who had a rough running engine, made a precautionary landing, and wound up with his airplane imprisoned by the FBO, who said that they were not going to sign it off. And we'll talk about how that all unfolded. And it's kind of an interesting story. And that's all I have, Tim, until next month.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. Great presentation. Looking forward to next month being the Tuesday after the first Wednesday. And yeah, so looking forward to that. And to everybody who tuned in, thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.